What's up, guys? This is RGT85, aka Sean. You might know me from YouTube, but you might know me from the best wrestling podcast out there, Stu's Wrestling Podcast.
You're listening to Stu's Wrestling Podcast. It's time. Your host, Stu Palmer.
Mind if I tag along? Could you just take some time on me? I don't want to cause alarm, but I can't remember how to feel. Would you take me back? Would you take me home? I need a human touch, it's not my own.
Well, we made it. It's the 100th episode of Stu's Wrestling Podcast. I want to thank you, the listeners, first and foremost, and the viewers, if you watch us on YouTube, for all the support. We are nearing 3 years of the show now too. I started in January 2019. You know, I'm going to say something here as well. There's a lot of episodes you might not have heard or listened or viewed or watched, so please have a look through. I've had lots of ex-WWE, WCW people on, NWA people, you name it, they've been on the show. And I just want to say also a big thank you to all the up and coming talent from the UK that's been on the show. We've tried to make it diverse over the 3 years, and it's been an absolute honour and a privilege to hear so many stories, so many good stories. Some emotional stuff as well along the way, but that's what makes the show so good. It's the guests that I've had on. Also, a big thank you to Chris Dutton, who's been editing the show since 2020 now. Nothing's ever a problem. I appreciate everything you do putting the show out. Thank you so much. And leading in to episode 100, my guest today is former WWE Magazine and WWE publication writer, Brian R. Solomon. Brian worked for the WWE at quite a pivotal time in the company's history. From 2000, the year 2000, we can remember the hotbed of talent coming through at that point, to 2007. So it's quite the time, the way WWE transitioned, and we get to hear about him also having an interview, an in-depth interview for the magazine with Vince McMahon, where he got to share 2 hours with the top dog in WWE. Brian writes for PWI, Pro Wrestling Illustrated. He has columns in there. He also has a column in Inside the Ropes magazine, which is UK based, but you can get it in the States. I know Barnes and Noble stock it there, so you can get that. Brian also has authored a brand new book on the career of WWE Hall of Famer, the original Sheik, Ed Farhat. You can get the book at Amazon and all good book stock. It's for pre-order in April. The title of the book is Blood and Fire, the unbelievable real-life story of wrestling's original Sheik. So yeah, we look forward to seeing that. I'm going to get a copy of that myself. That is out in April of 2022, and you can pre-order it right now. So my guest for the landmark 100th episode of Stu's Wrestling Podcast is Brian R. Solomon, former WWE magazine writer and WWE publication writer, and you can find him on PWI, Pro Wrestling Illustrated, and Inside the Ropes magazine. Enjoy. My guest for the landmark 100th episode of Stu's Wrestling Podcast is former WWF WWE writer. You also write for PWI, Pro Wrestling Illustrated. You've got a podcast with Pro Wrestling Illustrated. And you also write for Inside the Ropes, which is obviously UK based, but you can get it in the States, as I've seen. It is Mr. Brian R. Solomon on the show today.
Wow, do I really do all those things? That's a lot of things. I guess I'm pretty busy. Yep. Thanks for having me on.
You've got a lot of stuff going on. I think, just how's it been in more current times with Pro Wrestling Illustrated? Firstly, you know, writing and doing the podcast. I'd like to ask about that first and foremost, Brian.
Sure. Well, I'm glad that they actually, brought me on board with Pro Wrestling Illustrated as a regular contributor, because I've been contributing on and off to their publication since I left WWE in 2007. But it's only been in the last, I want to say, like 2 years, maybe a little less than 2 years, that I've been like every month writing articles for them, and then that led to Inside the Ropes, which, I mean, when I saw them starting up, and I saw some of my friends over there, I was like, I need to be a part of this. And I talked to some people. And the interesting thing is those guys it makes me feel old, but they grew up kind of reading my articles and reading the magazines and things. And they love these old school, WWE people and magazine people and everything. So they were happy to have me on board. So I think I have some kind of a record, because I think I might be the only writer to be writing for two different wrestling magazine companies at the same time. So I don't want to jinx it, but love it.
Is it nice not to be too heavily stipulated, being a writer for them, and then your time in WWF, WWE, I can assume you were told to a certain extent that the direction you had to go with articles and stuff. So yeah, how is that writing for PWI?
It's a little bit of retraining, I always tell Kevin McElvaney, who's the new editor-in-chief there, which is that I sometimes have to stop myself from going into like WWE shill mode and just, because that's part of what we did there. We were selling pay-per-views, we were selling merchandise, we were selling characters and angles and things. And, when you're writing for an independent magazine, that's not your job anymore. We try to cover it, in PWI's case, they really try to cover it like a sport, for example. And so I have to sometimes rein it in a little bit with the hype and the hyperbole. Everything's always the greatest of all time, and no match has ever been greater than this, and the most exciting ever, blah blah blah. So I have to kind of temper it a little bit, but I like it because it makes me can you hear me okay?
You're fine. You're still coming through.
Yeah, it makes me kind of a little freer and more. I'm able to write more as myself, basically, is what it comes down to.
I'm sure that's just nice for you as well to be, have that, able to do that.
Yeah, it is. And with Inside the Ropes, what I love about those guys is they really let you go. I mean, their articles have really high word counts from a writing point of view. And in the beginning, I was like, oh my God, I'm not used to writing this long. Like, well, I don't have anything else to say. But then I realized I do have more to say, but it's just I'm so used to having to abbreviate everything, my ideas. So with them, I really get to kind of broaden out and do more sidebars and really kind of take my time with the articles that I write for them. I would have to say that I know this is like inside writer stuff, but their page word count is probably double what I would be used to for most other magazines. And you can tell when you open it up and there's like a billion words on the page, but it's cool. I like to write in long form, so I'm just not used to doing it for magazines. That's all.
It's crazy. You're on board with Inside the Ropes. Bill Apter, my favorite pro wrestling journalist of all time. Kept kayfabe alive, obviously, back in the days. Yes. And Keith Elliott Greenberg, who's been a guest on the show previous year. What an array of writers for that magazine. It's testament to you guys all being on board on the same publication.
Oh, definitely. Bill is he's the godfather of wrestling magazine writers, photographers, whatever you want to say. And I'm really proud and honored that I can call him a friend. I mean, in the last 15 years or so, we've really become friends. And Keith, I'm glad that you got him on here, because Keith went from being somebody that, again, I read his articles when I was a kid. I went from that to he's now a writer that's sending me articles as an editor to edit, to go in the magazine. And I'm just going like, I'm not worthy of this. This is ridiculous. You should be editing my articles. But I learned so much from him. I really did, from being on the same team of writers as he is. And, he's just so good at what he does that, he helped me really get to where I am in terms of like my writing style when it comes to wrestling, for sure.
Really cool. All right, we're going to scoot back now. It'd be remiss of me not to ask about your tenure in WWF, WWE from 2000 to 2007. So yeah, how was that initially coming into the company and doing that role? And how was it? Did you have many dealings with Vince, or was it with other people?
Yeah, I did actually have dealings with him. Part of the reason for that is that I worked under Shane for quite a while there. So Shane was, for people that don't know, I worked for WWE Magazine and their whole family of magazines, their publication department, which doesn't exist anymore, from 2000 to 2007. And for, I would say, a good 4 of those 7 years, Shane McMahon was the head of our department. And he, hands-on, doing my performance reviews, the whole thing, staff meetings, everything. And so because of that, I wound up having a lot of dealings with Vince over the years, probably more than I needed to or wanted to, but I did. And, in a way it's cool because you get to have direct feedback, but in another way you think like, is this really necessary? Does the head of Disney have to approve like goofy baseball caps? I don't know if they bother him with that, but it was what it was. And it was helpful to have access to him. I was able to do 2 very long, and I mean like hours long, interviews with him over the years. I did one in 2002 and one in 2003, which, I mean, not a lot of people can say they did that. I mean, I'm really proud of that I got that kind of access, that close to him.
Is he intimidating? That's what I've got to ask you. Or is it always...
Yes.
Right, okay. Because I've heard different opinions with guys that have had on ex wrestlers who've worked for him, obviously. So yeah, so he was intimidating.
Yeah, he is, and it's like he's a human being, so I mean, he could be nice and personable and everything, but definitely larger than life, and you feel like you just know you're in the presence of somebody that's just on another level of the stratosphere than the rest of humans. Like anybody that's spent a lot of time, if you spend a lot of time around high-powered people, celebrities, billionaires, things like that, if you ever have, then you might know what I'm talking about. You just kind of get that sense that, this is a person, you don't get to be where he is and do the things he did and everything by just being an everyday ordinary Joe. It just, you have to be a special breed. And there were times where, he was completely approachable and personable. And then there's other times where he's totally a more kind of down-to-earth version of the TV character. Absolutely, without question. I mean, I remember one time he told me, and I don't know, is language an issue on this podcast?
You can say, okay. You can use expletives. It's not a problem on this show.
I was sitting across from him in a conference room meeting, and it was weird. It was really surreal. Like the meeting had ended and everybody had filtered out, and it was just him, me, and my publisher, Barry Werner, and we were just all just kind of like just talking. And I'm just like, what's happening right now? This is crazy. And because he was just feeling chatty. And when that happens, you're not going to just walk away, right? So we're just going with it. And I'm sitting across from him like this. And he says something to me. I forget the context or the reason, but he just goes, you can't really succeed in this business and at the level that I do. You can't really be a success without being kind of an asshole. And then he goes, well, you can't really be the kind of a guy who just kind of sits with his hands folded in his lap. And I looked down and I had my hands folded in my lap. And I'm like, all right, thanks a lot, Vince. And I like instinctively like opened my hands up and like tried to look more like an asshole or wherever he would want me to look. But it was his way of telling me like, you're too nice for this business, And that kind of in a nutshell is who he is. But that's what I mean, where like he had to be an asshole. He had to be a bloodthirsty guy to do what he did. He came into an industry, put everyone else out of business, and took it over. I mean, not everybody could do that, whether you like him or not. Like most human beings don't have within them the killer instinct to do that. So, for better or worse.
Absolutely. But did you feel pressure, Brian? I know that's quite an obvious question for me to ask. Was it pressure those 7 years, or did you just stay, calm with it in that role?
Well, the pressure was, like we see happening even now. People are always being let go, and it's not just the talent. Everybody knows about the talent, and it makes the news, but every time that happens, you dig a little deeper and you'll see it's office people too. It's personnel and company, staff. And so, I was a part of that. And I remember back then every year there would usually be like that time of year. It kind of is like that too now, but it's a little more chaotic. There would be that time of year where you would go, oh my God, okay, the releases are coming. I mean, this was a regular thing, and you would hope and cross your fingers and pray that you weren't one of the people. And I made it through 7 years, and then I was one of the people. But so that was the pressure of like, are we going to make it through another year? And it's a very hardworking environment. That's the thing. It's very hardworking in the sense that they ask a lot of people. So if you're not ready to work as hard as you ever have in your life, then it's not the place to be, because it can be high pressure environment. Even for me in a department where the magazines and publications, we were not a major profit center of the company. We were, one of the smaller pieces of the pie. So it maybe wasn't as bad as being in other places, like being in TV and things like that, but you still felt it. I remember I specifically, anytime a position would open up in the TV writing and creative writing, a lot of times they would come to us because we were writers, and they'd be like, hey, does anybody want this spot? Blah, blah. And I would always say, absolutely no way, never, no, because I knew I'd be gone in like a month, whereas if I didn't do that, I might actually stick around for a few years. And I was right, because I saw people do that, and they would go on the road or they'd go on the writing team, and their days were numbered. That's just, the turnaround. I mean, to be for every, Brian Gewirtz or like Ed Koski or somebody like that, there's a million other people that just come and go, and you don't even realize it, and you never even hear about them. So nature
of the beast, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. I think in and around that time, what a plethora of talent within the company, while you were there, it was incredible. The Attitude Era was still in full swing at that point as well. But yeah, any guys, any good memories from members of the roster during your time there? You've had good interactions and stuff.
So many. I mean, like you said, I was there from, I want to say like the later part of the Attitude Era, and then really into what they now call, we didn't call it then at the time, but what they now call the Ruthless Aggression Era, which only comes from the fact of that famous promo that Vince gave where he called for, I want everyone to show ruthless aggression, right? And so the whole era got its name from that. But yeah, I mean, I have to honestly say, when I got into it, I remember thinking, oh my God, these guys are going to be a handful, and all the testosterone and the ribbing and the, this and that. There were very few people that were very difficult or rude or made my life hard. There were sometimes like that, but really was the exception to the rule. Most of the guys and girls were personable, approachable, friendly, and they realized, the good ones, the smart ones, they realized that what we were doing was giving them exposure and helping to market their characters and their personas and getting them over, helping to get them over anyway. And so the ones who understood that, they understood, okay, maybe we're not getting paid for this. I'm not getting paid to do this photo shoot for this cover. I'm not getting paid to do this interview for Raw Magazine, but it helps me in the long run. So, most of the time they really were very generous with their time like that.
You pitched a lot of times, from what I've read online, about the history side of WWF, WWE, and going that route. But I read you were like shut down on it various times where you wanted to cover some of the old school stuff, because I know you're very much into pro wrestling history as well. So yeah, just why didn't they take on board what you were saying?
Well, I think I was just a little ahead of the curve on that. So like I was saying, when I got there, it was still in the midst of the Attitude Era. So they weren't really that interested in history. If you remember that time period, the Hall of Fame was gone. And if you had been watching WWF prior to the Attitude Era, there was a little bit more kind of acknowledging of history and things like that. And even with some of the characters and personas, when it came to the Attitude Era, they didn't really need it anymore. They were printing money. So, because you have to remember, in wrestling, everything is about making money in the wrestling business. Everything. I know this breaks people's hearts, but even nostalgia, Hall of Fame, things like that. And this is why if there's going to be a wrestling Hall of Fame, it needs to be independent, really. And there are those that are. It needs to be independent of a company, because the WWE Hall of Fame is a revenue stream. That's the thing. It's nostalgia for profit. And there's nothing wrong with that. It is a business. But when I was there in the beginning, that was not the business they were in. They were just not interested in that. Like I've said before, it was just on to the next show, on to the next pay-per-view. And that changed while I was there, thankfully. And I don't take credit for that. I'm not saying, it's because of me that they started being more history-minded. But it did happen while I was there. And I do sometimes feel that the efforts of WWE Magazine are part of the reason why that happened. And not just WWE Magazine, but all the magazines that we were doing, because we were very history minded in those magazines. We were very trying to draw from the past to tell our stories. And we would talk about statistics in a way that they never did on TV. We would talk about connections with what's happening right now and the past, which they never did on TV. And you hear them do that a lot more today than I remember when I was a kid watching wrestling, talking about statistics and talking about like things that happened years ago in the business. Like, they'll talk about like even the fact that they reference the Attitude Era all of the time. If we think about that, we're talking about 20 years ago. That would be like if you were watching TV during the Attitude Era and they could not shut up about Bruno Sammartino and Bob Backlund every 5 seconds, right? Which was not the case at all. Not at all. So that's what I mean when I say that history is much more a part of the product now than it was back then. And I kind of rode the crest of that, and I was glad to do that. And it led to my first book, which was WWE Legends, that I wrote for them. But that was a big change that happened while I was there.
It's good to know that you got that happened. You push for it. That's incredible, absolutely incredible. Now, current wrestling, what are your thoughts and feelings? I know we've had another load of cuts in the past week from WWE, but realistically, how many more guys can AEW take on? Because it's just the roster, in my opinion, the roster's fine, but they can't be looking to add any more at the moment because there's people getting lost in the shuffle. The likes of your Brian Cages, and people of that nature. What are your feelings with the current, times?
Well, I still follow it very closely. I'm one of those people who sometimes you either have people that they love current wrestling, they know nothing about wrestling history really before, they started watching, or you have the people that are all they care about is the old stuff. They can't stand the new stuff. Now, I will say I prefer old school wrestling. It's my preference, but I still enjoy it. I still watch wrestling. I mean, I write for these magazines, so I need to stay current, and I feel like it's a very different time now. And I think we have to remember, when you say, like, for example, people like Brian Cage getting lost in the shuffle or whatever, something we have to remember now, which I think they understood more back then, is not everybody can be a top guy. Not everybody is going to be the main event, and that's okay. I'd rather have that than have this hot potato where like everybody gets to hold the title. Everybody, it's like a constant rotating door of, okay, now it's your turn to be in the main event. Now it's your turn to be in the main event. Now I get to be in the main event. Sometimes you need to have your top guys, you have your middle guys, you have your bottom guys. And I mean, if you look back at the era of Hulk Hogan, right? I mean, not to say that was the way you want to go, but it was a one-man show. It was a one-man show, and everybody else that was there was along for the ride. And, the rising tide lifts all ships, as they say, right? It's not like that anymore now. And that's partly for a reason, is you don't want to hang everything on this one person. Then what happens if they leave? What happens if they realize how valuable they are and they start using that for leverage? So that's partly why it is the way it is right now, where you have so many people at the top. But it also leads to this expectation that everybody needs to have this huge push. Everybody needs to be, near the top or at the top. It's impossible. If everybody's at the top, then there's no top, right? So you need to have tiers, and so I really have no problem with that. But again, like you were saying too, AEW, they can't just be thinking we're going to bring all these people in. That's impossible, and it's not smart. And I don't think there should be that expectation. I mean, everybody says, well, okay, now they're going to hire all these people. I don't know where they get that expectation from. They're hiring the people that they think that have a place there, that they think they can use. And unfortunately, when you have cuts like what's been happening, there are some people who will land on their feet, whether it be AEW or making a really good career on the indies, because now you've got a really good asking price. And there's going to be some people that are going to have to find another, career. It happens all the time. There's some people that are not really going to be able to make a living at wrestling anymore. But it's always been like that.
It's weird they're going back to the releases. They've rebranded Keith Lee, and then a month or two later, he's been shelved. And I know he's going to go on to somewhere else and do fantastic. I just understand they've repackaged the guy, and then a month or two later, he's gone. He's released. The mind boggles, but like we have seen it time and time again. And
the same thing happened with Aleister Black, where he was repackaged and then gone. And you thought, okay, well, they obviously have big plans for this guy. And so see, that shouldn't happen. What happened with Keith Lee, you'll never, you would never really see that kind of thing happen. And I think that speaks to maybe a certain amount of miscommunication on a corporate level, where if you have a person that you're getting rid of, you're not going to put in the creative effort on this person. In fact, you should probably have them out there putting other people over on the way out. And the fact that they're not doing that does make it seem very haphazard sometimes, like there isn't a game plan, and sort of like the money people are not talking to the creative people, or there isn't a go-between. There isn't kind of open lines of communication maybe between these groups as much as there should be. It's just much more chaotic for sure.
Who do you enjoy watching? I know that could be very broad and we could talk about numerous guys, but yeah, who are some of the guys you enjoy watching in current terms, in current wrestling?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Keith Lee. I love him. I really always feel like he has a great potential because he's a very big guy who can move like a very small guy. You don't see a lot of people like that. I mean, he's like Vader was like that. Like I put Vader up there as probably, in terms of my own experience of what I've seen, the greatest performing big man that I've ever seen in terms of really being able to move and really being able to work. And he's kind of in a category like that. I love watching him. I love Eddie Kingston. I think he's great. He's just so believable, and everything he does comes from a place of reality. So he's very cool for that kind of thing. I just really, really enjoy him. I think, there's a lot of really good talent now between the two companies. I have grown to enjoy Roman Reigns. He's somebody that I thought was dead in the water after all the years they had of trying to get him over as a babyface, as the babyface. They finally woke up and did what they probably should have done with Cena, halfway into his run, and made him into this incredible monster heel. WWE creative doesn't have a lot of things going for it right now, but he's one of the things. And Heyman is a big reason for that too. I mean, they're great. They're just great. I enjoy that very much. I mean, eventually it's going to run out of steam and you're going to have to think of what else you're going to do with this guy, but it is working right now. And the amount of people that they've had him work with and still have the people responding very positively to it. That's encouragement to just keep going with it. So that's another thing that I enjoy watching too, for sure.
Obviously we've got Full Gear coming up this weekend. Now I'm a firm believer they're going to add more pay-per-views. They're obviously sticking to 3 or 4 a year, aren't they? But Full Gear is going to be, I think it'll be as good as All Out. I really do believe. But yeah, how do you feel with Full Gear and the card that they've put together?
Well, it goes to show you the kind of buzz that's around that show right now. You just don't get that these days with WWE shows, unless it's maybe like WrestleMania. Like here we've got Survivor Series coming up, right? The week after that. I mean, I don't know. I feel like nobody's talking about that. It's almost like, I mean, not even WWE is talking about it. They announced the Survivors matches on social media, like in the middle of a Saturday afternoon or whatever. And just like an afterthought kind of. And with AEW, you do get the sense that every pay-per-view is something very special. And I would be against increasing the amount of pay-per-views.
Right, okay.
I always felt that monthly pay-per-views was not a good idea, but what do I know? I'm not, on the business side of wrestling. So I feel like it makes everything seem less special. It burns the fans out. It creates less urgency to go to a live event. That's another byproduct of it that happens. And, I think AEW, the number they have right now, it feels just right. And these events, it creates anticipation. You're waiting for it. This Hangman Page and Kenny Omega thing, we've been waiting for this. We want to see this. There's buzz around it. There's excitement. The Punk and Kingston thing, even though it hasn't had nearly as long a build, it's very short build, the intensity around it is just off the charts, and some of the other matches that they have that, happening there and the finals of the women's tournament for the TBS title and those kind of things. We've been watching this happen week to week and leading into this, and it feels very organic and natural. See, because that's the other thing with the monthly pay-per-views, and I'll put my foot in my mouth if AEW eventually goes to this model, but it often feels like, well, it's time for the monthly pay-per-view. Here we go. This is it. What are we going to slot in here? Boom, 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 boom. And it doesn't feel like the way it used to feel, which is these intense feuds and angles are boiling to a head, and the only way to settle it is this big, huge, mega spectacular that we have coming. It feels like, you know what I mean? It would feel like the event would grow, even though it wasn't. The event would grow organically out of the storylines that were coming. And there's less of that now. But AEW has more of that feel now than WWE has.
I used to love going back now when Sean Mooney was at the event center, and then he had Mean Gene doing the report, building up to the pay-per-view. So, like when we only had 4, obviously King of the Ring came in more latterly officially as a show. But yeah, I know what you're saying in terms of the building of stuff and the way they're going. And that's the Khan's business model, I think, isn't it?
I can't remember when it happened. Maybe you might remember. I don't know if it was when they started the In Your Houses where they had monthly pay-per-views or if it happened in the Attitude Era. But at a certain point, those event centers went away. They stopped doing them where, you had a clear idea of what matches were coming and everyone got to do their promos. I mean, I even remember the days when they do that for house shows. You'd be watching and they'd have your localized promos. I don't know if they did that over there with WWE. They
did for the tours, for the UK tours, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Man. And they'd be like, when I get my hands on you in the Nassau Coliseum, they do that kind of thing. And it made it feel so special. You'd go. I remember as a kid before I really understood how that worked with house shows, I would really be like, oh my God, I got to find out. Is Hulk Hogan going to lose this title? Like, I can't go to this show. I'm not going. How am I going to know if Killer Khan becomes the World Wrestling Federation champion? And I would look in the newspapers. I would try and I would talk to my friends the next day in school. Were you at the Meadowlands last night? Did Killer Khan win the title? What happened? But there was that excitement. And then it gets to the point now where it's the brand that sells the tickets and sells the pay-per-views. I mean, I remember clearly when that happened by the late 90s, and I would go to a house show and I wouldn't even know who the hell was even on the card. I mean, I'd be going, does anybody know what matches are happening here? And like, no one even knew. And you open the program, and instead of like having the list of matches, it would just be talking about whatever storylines were happening on TV. It was like this all-purpose generic thing that would cover whatever matches they happened to throw together. And that's the kind of thing that happened, where it became less about matches and characters and more about this brand And I know why they did it, because I've spoken to people within the company who said specifically why, which is that's what they want. They don't want people coming to see specific wrestlers as much as they want them coming to see WWE, so that no matter who is on the card and no matter who leaves them or, goes somewhere else, doesn't matter. And that really is something that has come to fruition in the past, like 15 years, I would say. Like John Cena and even John Cena didn't have the power of like a Stone Cold or a Rock or a Hogan or a Warrior or something. John Cena was the last gasp almost of that, where it's like, we are going to see John Cena. John Cena is here. I want to see him. If John Cena is not on that card, I'm not going. He really feels like the last gasp of that.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. I remember going to house shows. I went to SmackDown house shows specifically around 2002, 2003. And it was just crazy when you look back who was on the card. Angle, Undertaker, Benoit, Eddie Guerrero, and Heyman was the genesis of all that, wasn't he? SmackDown was outperforming Raw at the time, but it was great going to house shows because they went outside their personalities a little bit. It always felt a bit freer than what you saw on television. So I love going to them shows, and SmackDown, that was when SmackDown was at the heights of popularity and ratings.
Yeah, and SmackDown had the cruiserweights too.
Yeah.
My preference has always been house shows, and I know sometimes I talk to newer fans, and they just can't understand it because house shows have been so de-emphasized now. And I know a lot of young fans that aren't even aware that there are house shows. They don't even know that there are shows that aren't on television. And in their mind, the only, if they go to a house show, they don't understand. There's people that are going like, where's the TV cameras? What's going on? Why is it just a bunch of matches? And I'm over here going like, that's what a wrestling show is. That's what it actually is a series of matches. And, in a way, Attitude Era television, the era of Raw and Nitro, and the idea of every weekly card being like this incredible blockbuster show where like storylines are advanced and you have great matches every week. It sounds great on paper, but it burns out the fans and it raises expectations to an unrealistic degree that you can't always maintain. Is what they used to call hot shotting back in the day. And you didn't want to do it for the exact reason of where we are now. Like promoters always had the ability to do that if they wanted. We're going to throw everything out there. We're going to have title changes constantly happening. We're going to have people turning on each other all the time. We're going to, every week on TV, you're going to see the kind of card that you would have to pay money to see. But they didn't do that because they knew if they did that, well, where do we go from there? What happens when people get sick of that? We have to be more conservative. We have to be careful. We have to like deal it out in these little kind of, ways to keep people wanting more, almost like a drug, right? And with the Attitude Era and beyond, they just put everything out there. And now we have a desensitized audience. See, I love a good house show. I love going to the show and just being entertained by the show. Let's see some great matches. It doesn't have to change the world for me every show. I want to see some great talent, some great matches. I'll go on WWE Network. And again, this is my bias because I'm an old school wrestling fan. I'm more entertained. They just dropped a bunch of 1984 Madison Square Garden house shows on Peacock, which we have here as the WWE Network. Mm-hmm. I'm more entertained watching that than an episode of Raw or SmackDown and most pay-per-views, honestly. I'd rather watch those house shows. It just, there's something about it where it's the self-contained piece of entertainment. We're not necessarily worried about where it's going, where it was, or, what's going to happen. It's just, let's put on a great, exciting show and have you suspend your disbelief for a couple of hours. And that's something that's been lost a little bit, I think.
Well surmised. Nice to get your take on it. Absolutely. Now, Now, you've said you're an old school fan. You're a fan for many, many years. Who were some of your favourites when you were growing up and further ahead? And some favourite matches as well. I struggled myself trying to encapsulate. Someone says, "Give me your top three." I can't do it, so I know it's putting you on the spot a little bit. But yeah, who were some of the guys you love to watch and matches as well? Extending that question.
Well, I first got into, I mean, even though I became a fan of everything even before that, of learning about it, but as a kid watching, about the time of WrestleMania 3 was when I really started getting into it. So it's late 80s, and my fandom went off the charts, I want to say, early 90s and mid 90s, even though everybody talks about how bad WWE got at that point. That was the height of my just mania. I was a teenager or college years, and it was WWF and WCW. I loved WCW during the kind of like Bill Watts, early Eric Bischoff era. Like my favorite era of WCW is, and this isn't a knock on Flair because I love Flair, but it just happened to be from the time that Flair left in 91 to go to WWF to the time that they brought Hogan in. That window, like 91 to 94, is one of the great unsung periods of wrestling to me. That era of WCW, they may have been a second banana to WWF, but their TV product for me was great. I loved watching them in that era. But I mean, my favorites, I guess, when I first started watching, I was a Randy Savage fan. I was not one of these Hulk Hogan kids. I was the guy that wanted to see him finally lose. And I was rooting for Andre the Giant, as crazy as that sounds. And when Andre beat him, it didn't really beat him with the twin referees. I was jumping up and down on the couch, just, oh, finally, he's not the champion anymore. And I was excited to see Savage as this new standard bearer, top, I didn't know the term babyface back then, but top babyface world champion. I liked that idea of changing it up a little bit. And I laugh today because people will have a guy that's been champion for 6 months, 7 months, and they're going, let's change things up. Things are getting stale. And I'm going like, imagine if every pay-per-view ended the exact same way for 4 years. Every single time it was the same person winning and celebrating in the ring. And that's what that was. So, I mean, I loved Savage for that. I loved the Hart Foundation, the British Bulldogs. The first Madison Square Garden show I ever went to, the first wrestling show I ever went to, July 1987, it had Hart Foundation versus the British Bulldogs. And I mean, it was almost too good to be true to be able to get to see something like that. So I was a fan of Ric Flair. I didn't get to see him in his prime at that time because I lived in the Northeast and I didn't have cable. But I always was a fan of his stuff. Who else? Well, I mean, in the WCW years, I loved Vader when he was world champion. I thought he was such a believable, terrifying heel. It was so great to get into watching him. That's one of the things I love about wrestling. My own personal preference is the people that enable me to the people that would make it easier for me to suspend my disbelief. It's not a competitive sport, but you want to be able to just kind of like squint a little bit and go, oh, maybe it kind of is a little bit. I could just play along with it while I'm watching it. And I find it's harder to do that now. So I always like the people that made it just a little bit easier to do that. Bret Hart, when he was on top, that was a dream come true for me because my favorite match back then as a kid was Bret Hart versus Mr. Perfect at SummerSlam 91. And I was like 16 years old. And that to me was like a sea change moment in WWF because they didn't put a premium on, that kind of wrestling, like the more athletic, what you call like the technical scientific style of wrestling. That company wasn't really about that at that time. And that match was not like anything you saw back then. And it became more the norm. I think looking back now, you go like, well, it's just a match. But that match became a blueprint for like, hey, we could do more matches like that in WWF now. And there were kids watching that and matches like that. Bret Hart versus Davey Boy Smith was another one. Bret Hart versus Owen Hart people watch those matches and then grew up to become the wrestlers that want to have matches like that. So I don't think you have a Finn Balor or a Seth Rollins or Cesaro or anybody like that without the era of Bret Hart and Shawn Michaels, because I think that those guys grew up watching that and wanting to be like that. So anyway, what I'm trying to say is, because I love that match and I loved when they broke Bret out as a singles guy, that when they finally gave him that big push, I was so ready for it. I was so thankful that they chose him, because I felt like in years gone by before that, Bret would have just been a mid-card guy. He would have been Intercontinental, and that's it. And the fact that they went all the way with him, I was so excited. I just, anything that he was involved with, I loved watching, and those years were great for me. That's why I say, even though that's that added that what the new generation era, right? It gets kind of dumped on a lot. I loved that time of wrestling. I really did. Even when they had Madison Square Garden crowds of like 2,000 people, I was one of those 2,000 people. I loved that era.
No question, no question. I was at SummerSlam 92, and just the fact that Bret is still up there. Until I met him at WrestleCon in 2013, I could hardly muster up a sentence, and that's that's not hard for me, because I've met Flair, I've met Kurt Angle, all the guys over the years, but Bret, I struggled because I've idolized him from 4 years old. Just incredible. The matches don't date. The matches still hold up today.
Yeah. People talk about the match I loved of his, which was the one with the 1-2-3 Kid on Raw, and now CM Punk, when he had his match, I'm trying to remember who the heck it was. They made a whole thing.
Darby, was it when he had?
It was the Darby Allin.
Yeah. They did the same.
Yeah, and I'm watching it going, that's Bret Hart and the 1-2-3 Kid. But that's what I mean. It's like those guys were watching that stuff. And when I came to work for WWE, it was during the years when Bret was definitely on the outs. It was, he was in WCW in the beginning, and when I got there, and then he retired, and he was and it was before he mended fences and all that. So, but I did get to interview him once. And a lot of people may not remember this, but in 2005, I want to say it was, he actually, and this is 5 years before he came back on WWE television, he actually made a deal with them to do a DVD release. And because they were doing a DVD release, Shane worked out a deal to also do a magazine. He sort of shoehorned us in there. And even the people who remember the DVD thing, they don't even usually remember the magazine. But because they did a special edition Bret Hart magazine in 2005, I got to do it. They were like, do you want to do the interview? Are you kidding me? What? The last thing I expected coming to work here was, I was hoping that I want to talk to this guy, that guy, this guy. But Bret Hart, I never thought that would happen. They put me on the phone with them. It wasn't in person. It was on the phone. But I want to say like 2 hours on the phone. Just me and Bret Hart, and I got to ask him anything I wanted. That was one of the benefits of working for Shane, was that doors would open like that, because if Shane said something, it happened. Like his name, and it carried some weight. And so that I'm grateful that I got the chance to interview Bret Hart at length.
Incredible. So that's like a pinch yourself moment, isn't it? The fan aspect, and you got to have those 2 hours.
I had a lot of pinch myself moments in those 7 years, for sure. I did.
Not just to pigeonhole him, absolutely. I can well imagine. But no, good answers. I had to ask about the fan perspective stuff to you, obviously.
Yeah.
But more current times and stuff coming up. We've got Blood and Fire, the first biography of the Sheik, the original Sheik as well. Might add Ed Farhat, NWA Hall of Famer, WWE Hall of Famer, and you are the author for this book, which is due out on the 12th of April 2022. So I did a bit of digging online.
Yes, I did, and I am, and I know that in the UK, the name of the Sheik may not be as well known as it is in other parts of the world, like in the US, in Japan, in parts of Asia where he toured, but So when you say the Sheik, I think a lot of people, the first thing they'll think of is the Iron Sheik, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to do this book, because that even happens here in America now, because you're talking about someone who's been, he's been dead for almost 20 years. He was not a major national star for about 40 years now. It's been a long time. But in his day, he was the hottest heel, the most money drawing, fear inducing main event heel everywhere he went of anyone in the business. I mean, I'd put him up here. He can stake a claim to be called the greatest heel of all time, depending on what metrics you're using. And like Jim Cornette has said, this is a famous quote that I put in the book, which is, nobody drew more money in more places for longer period of time than the Sheik. You're talking about 60s, 70s, all through those years, like a good 15, 20, 25 year run at least, where he was a main event anywhere he went in North America and then later on in Japan. And people believed him. I mean, he lived his gimmick 110%. I don't even want to call it a gimmick. In the book, I don't even use that word for it. It's a persona that he lived. And so when I realized that no one had ever told his story, I couldn't think of anyone at his level, especially from his period, that had never had a biography. It seems like everyone and their mother these days in wrestling has had a biography, and he never did. And I said, I need to change this, because I'd been fascinated with him. He was before my time, like I said, but I was fascinated with him from a historical point of view. And I pitched the idea to ECW Press, who's known for doing wrestler biographies. I said, I'd really like to do it with them, because they had just done the Andre the Giant one with Bertrand Hébert and Pat Laprade. And I said, I would, I feel like this book could be in that category. And they went for it. I'm really grateful for it. So like you said, it comes out in April, but it's already available for pre-sale. And it actually was very recently the #1 wrestling book on Amazon, just based on pre-sales. Like, I was blown away by that. People were letting me know. People were sending me the link. I mean, it's not right now, but I feel like once it comes out, it will be again. I'm very excited about the buzz around the book. I didn't even expect that to happen for someone that's been gone for so long, but there's a lot of expectation around this book. So I hope I deliver. I think I did, but we'll see. We'll see in April.
Great news on the pre-sales there, and where it was charting. That's amazing. And he was the precursor of hardcore before hardcore was even a thing, wasn't he?
Yeah. And not only in his own performance, but he had his own wrestling company. In those territory days, he was the guy who ran basically Michigan, Ohio. He had parts of Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Southern Ontario in Canada. So it was a nice chunk of what would be, I guess, the part of the American Midwest a little bit. And that style is what he proliferated in that area. Every area had their own style. And that's what the fans of that area grew to expect. And so if you were a wrestling fan in Detroit, Cincinnati, Windsor, Ontario, places like that, Cleveland, that is the wrestling that you grew up with in those days, which was very violent. There was a lot of blood, and the Sheik was known for throwing fire. I don't think the type of hardcore that he did, it was nothing like what you'd later see in ECW, and then of course even beyond that in like CZW and XPW and FMW and crazy things like that. But it was definitely the precursor of that, and that's why even in FMW, Asushi Onita was a disciple of the Sheik. I mean, he worshipped the Sheik. He used to carry the Sheik's bags in the 70s. For real, when the Sheik would come to Japan. And so when he was founding this company, he said, I need the Sheik. And the Sheik was an old man by that point. He was in his 60s. And he didn't even know if the Sheik was still alive, still wrestling. The answer to both those questions was yes. So he brought the Sheik. And, people talk about Sabu from that era, because Sabu was made by that FMW run. You got to remember, at the time, it was really, we want the Sheik. And, he has this nephew we've never heard of. And if we bring in the Sheik, we have to bring that kid along. Okay, I guess we could do that. Sure. If it makes the Sheik happy, will give his nephew this opportunity. That's what it was at that time. But really, also, Sheik needed Sabu because Sheik was old and had a lot of trouble moving around, couldn't really do the things he used to do. And Sabu was a young man and was able to really carry those matches and do a lot of the heavy lifting while the Sheik got to just be the Sheik, which was really enough. But yeah, I mean, he that's sort of the legacy he's remembered for today, which is being an innovator of the hardcore style. But he really was so much more than that. I mean, so much more. Just the believability that he portrayed as this evil heel. You could watch videos of people scattering in his wake, just in terror of this guy. And even back then, a lot of the attitude of fans that were even smarter, let's say, it was sort of like, we know wrestling is a work, we get it, but we're not totally sure about this guy. We don't know if this guy knows that it's a work. You know, Terry Funk, who I interviewed for the book, he gave me the greatest quote, which I wound up using as the opening quote of the book, which is, he said to me, I'll try to do the Terry Funk impression if I can, but he said to me, everybody likes to say that wrestling's fake. Well, nobody told that son of a bitch. and that's from a guy that worked with him for a long time and grew up around him, because the Sheik worked for his father in the 60s when Terry was in high school and college. So he would know how dangerous the Sheik was.
I look forward to this coming out, officially. I'll definitely be getting. I love my pro wrestling history, so yeah, absolutely look forward to that. And yes, I'm just trying to think now. Where can the viewers and the listeners find you in terms of the socials and social media, where they can find you?
Sure, there's a few places. On Twitter and Instagram, I am Brian R. Solomon. On Facebook, if you look up Pro Wrestling FAQ. I do a lot of wrestling updates and information about my wrestling related work there. I also have a website. It has kind of an unwieldy URL, but you will find it if you go to my social media. So that's kind of the best places that you can find me online.
Thank you so much. Brian Solomon, former WWF, WWE writer from 2000 to 2007, pro wrestling historian. You can find Brian with Pro Wrestling Illustrated, one of the best publications there is, and also the UK-based Inside the Ropes magazine as well, but you can get it. I know Barnes & Noble in America do stock it because people get it 2 or 3 weeks after normally the issue over there. So yeah, it is available worldwide. And just thank you for coming on for the 100th episode of Stu's Wrestling Podcast. It's an absolute pleasure.
I'm flattered to be the 100th guest. I didn't know that coming in, but I will take that accolade and I will add it to my impressive list of honors. So thank you. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Brian. Much appreciated. A big thank you to Powered 4 TV for putting the episodes up on the on-demand service there. Big thank you to John Scott and Rich Crowhurst for all the support. Really appreciate it week in, week out. Nothing's ever a problem. Also, we're doing Powered 4 TV Big Fight Weekly, the MMA and boxing show with my cousin Rich and John have put on these first. It's been fantastic with that. Thank you to Chris Dutton again, as always, for the superb editing. I couldn't do this without him. And fantastic job once again. Thank you to Mike Angus for the intro, as always, to the show. You can find the Stu's Wrestling Podcast merch at WrestleMerchCentral.com. There is loads of stuff, lots of different items that you can get. Mugs, hats, face coverings, t-shirts, hoodies, even the new varsity jacket with embroidered Stu's Wrestling Podcast logo on it. Big thank you once again to Dean and the team for listing my products on there. Great work, great work. And we will see you soon for the next episode of Stu's Wrestling Podcast.